Greetings, everyone. Welcome to America 250's community conversation about the Hornet's Nest, a novel of the Revolutionary War by former President Jimmy Carter. With these community conversations, we want to engage with communities from across the United States and around the world. Panelists and participants have the opportunity to share what the U.S. semi-quincentennial means to them and their communities, to share their hopes for the America 250 commemoration and celebration, and reflect on the people, places, and events that have shaped the American spirit. America 250 will be hosting these community conversations regularly through 2026, and we hope you can join us for more of them. I am Megan Springate, Director of Engagement here at America 250, and I'll be your moderator for today. I've got a little bit of housekeeping before we get going. The conversation is being recorded and will be available on our website shortly after we are done. Please use the chat or the Q&A function to ask questions or comments to the panel. And a reminder that America 250 and these conversations are nonpartisan. And I want to make a shout out to Stephanie, Mari, Kara, Maria, and all the folks here at America 250 who keep everything running smoothly behind the scenes. And also a thank you to our ASL interpreters who are joining us today. Before we meet our panelists, let me introduce America 250's President and CEO, Joe Daniels. Joe will give us a brief overview of what America 250 is to help set the stage for our conversation. Joe?
Thank you so much, Megan. It's really great to be here today, and I just wanted to express my gratitude for our panelists and all of the participants. It's really meaningful that you're a part of this. And I think that, as Megan said, we're going to be doing community conversations all the way through, up and through the commemoration. And by being with us at this relatively early stage, I think it really will help inform our plans for the commemoration. And I hope will help you feel a part of what we think will be a really special endeavor. Just to give you a second about my background and what brought me here. I started as the CEO of the America 250 Foundation late last fall. And over these first few months that I've been here, it's really confirmed one of the reasons, or really the reason why I came here, which is that I see this, and I think I know my team sees this as well, but as a really historic opportunity to bring the country together around a milestone that is just tremendously important. The United States has had a tremendous amount of impact around the world and of course here at home. And the 250th is a milestone for all of us to step back and not only celebrate and look at everything that we've accomplished, but also as a moment in time to reflect on our first 250 years, to understand all of the stories, all of the aspects of what made America what it is today. You know, many of those stories, or at least some of those stories, are ones that are really easily accessible and really easily recalled by most Americans. But to really understand our country and who we are, it's so important to delve into the hidden histories and delve into the stories that and the histories that we may not know on the tip of our tongues. And I think that one of the important points about doing these community conversations is to bring to light some of these stories. And certainly the panel and the subject today is an example of that. In my previous experience, I was the founding CEO of the National September 11th Memorial and Museum. Hopefully many of you, if not most of you, have visited the memorial and the museum. And if not, please go visit. My experience there taught me many things, but one of the most important is what this country can do when we come together in support of one another with just limitless compassion. It didn't matter in the days, weeks, and months following 9/11, whether you were left or politically on the right, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic class. There was something really powerful about that feeling that we were all in this together. And I remember years later, deep into the project, people would ask me, they'd say, isn't it a shame that that unity we felt after 9/11 seems to have dissipated and we're kind of back to where we were? And my point always to them was that was okay, that we are a democracy, and we are supposed to fight and argue and debate. But that what events like 9/11 showed us is that when the time's required, we can be there for one another. And I would say that my hope and my aspiration is that the 250th, the semi-quincentennial, is another opportunity, of course, coming from a different place, not a tragedy, but is another opportunity where we can set aside what divides us and really deeply understand that America is this daring experiment in democracy because of our diversity and not in spite of it. That there's just a huge amount of pride that we can take when we see how Americans interact with each other, in real life, not necessarily on social media or listening to the news. At the same time, it's also an understanding that by understanding our history, we can give ourselves the best chance to perfect this union, to understand that what our founding fathers got right in our founding in 1776 was these incredible ideals and values and rights that were really defined this great experiment. But that what we got wrong as a country in 1776 is that those great ideals and values and rights were only applied to a very, very small amount of who made up America. And that this opportunity at the 250th year mark is a chance to look back and chart the progress that has been made to making sure that the full rights of Americans is actually enjoyed by the people of our country, and that where we have fallen short or where there is more progress that needs to come, this is an opportunity to come together to ensure that that progress and that journey of perfecting this union is really attacked in the most robust way we can together moving forward. As a history major myself, I'm super excited about this topic today. President Carter, the author, of course, lived an incredible American life. And I always like to characterize that by, big public figures who have just had experiences and have had their own personal evolutions in what they've done. And President Carter, post-presidency, is just an incredible example of someone who loves his country, is committed to it, and has just done so much to enrich who we are as a country. So with that, I'll turn it over back to Megan. Again, I'm so grateful for everyone being here. I look forward to having you as a part of our journey, and we need your voice in this. We won't succeed on July 4th, 2026, when all this culminates, unless we've executed this commemoration in a fashion that truly reflects who we are as a country. So thank you very much, and thanks, Megan.
Thank you, Joe. Just to the audience, I will say that after the conversation, you'll receive a survey, and included in those questions will be, what are the kinds of conversations would you like to see us hosting for this community conversation series? So when we say that we want you to be a part of it, we mean it. So please do reach out and let us know what you want to talk about, and we will work with all that information that we get. So again, thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
Okay, so I also see there's a lot of activity in the chat, folks sharing where they're from. Please, that's fantastic. I'd love to see the engagement in the chat function. Please continue that. We are keeping an eye on it, and we will get to some of those questions and comments as well. So to start off, The Hornet's Nest by President Jimmy Carter tells the story of the American Revolution through the lens of historical fiction. The complex read covers life in colonial America, 18th century politics, the experiences of Native Americans during that time and their removal from homelands as part of the expansion of the United States, and the South's influence in the war. The Hornet's Nest is the first work of fiction by a former president of the United States And it was Jimmy Carter's research into his ancestors' role in the Revolutionary War that inspired him to write this book. The story of the protagonist, Ethan Pratt, closely echoes that of Carter's ancestors who traveled to New Jersey, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and then Georgia with a group of Quakers. The Hornet's Nest gives life to the conflict and immerses readers in the development of our daring experiment and experience in democracy. So now I'd like to invite our guest speakers from the National Park Service to introduce themselves and share a little bit about the work they do. Jacob, would you like to start?
Sure. So hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name's Jacob. I'm the lead interpretive park ranger at the Jimmy Carter National Historical Park. We're located in Plains, Georgia, about 2.5, 3 hours out of Atlanta. And we preserve the cultural resources surrounding President Carter's boyhood growing up, his boyhood farm, but also the high school where he attended. And we tell a lot of the stories of the influences that made President Carter into the man that he is today. So, you know, I'm happy to join you all and answer any questions that you'll have later on in the program. So be thinking about things from President Carter's perspective, why he wanted to dig in so much to the Southern campaign of the Revolution, which doesn't get talked about quite a lot in American history. It's usually overlooked. Usually you hear about Bunker Hill, but you never hear about Savannah during the Revolution. But also be thinking about President Carter as a political figure. When he's writing this book, he is, you know, a historian himself. Why is he writing this book? What stories does he want to tell us about our political history as a country and the values that he then brings into his presidency and beyond? The values that he wants to espouse for the future of our nation. When he was a young politician, you know, coming into America's second century, he definitely had a lot of views on that. And what does it mean as we look ahead to our third century as a country in the future? So it's a grand experiment, and President Carter certainly played a role in helping us define those values that we held through the Revolution and how they've evolved with us today.
Thanks, Jacob. Tanya?
Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be joining you today. My name is Tanya Waggle, and I'm a park ranger at Colonial National Historical Park. So at Colonial, we preserve the sites of historic Jamestown and Yorktown battlefield. And my role here as an interpretive ranger is to help preserve the sites and the stories of these places by inspiring the next generation of stewards. So I have the opportunity to do this by creating and facilitating program at the park and interacting with visitors to find ways to connect them to the resource. So I'm really excited to be chatting with y'all today and tying, you know, Carter's story to some of the events that unfold here at Yorktown battlefield.
Great, thank you both. So I'm gonna share a map of the Southern campaign from our courtesy of our friends at the American Battlefield Trust. Just to give some context, I'll leave it up for the first question in particular, and then I'll take it down so we can concentrate on the speakers. But then if anybody wants to reference it again, just let me know and I'll share my screen. So here's the map of the Southern campaign. We've got the National Park Service, Associated National Park Service units are flagged here. I encourage folks to visit those. There's some amazing interpretive staff who can really dig into the history and the meaning of that. So it was mentioned earlier, right? The Revolutionary War is often taught with almost an exclusive focus on the North, if not an exclusive focus on the North. And we think of Boston, we don't think of Savannah. Why do we know so little about the South's crucial role in the Revolutionary War? And can you give us some background on the Southern campaign?
Yeah, so I think a portion of why, you know, our view may be skewed to the events that occurred in the North is because, again, what Carter pointed out in his review of the book, sometimes in history, we pull out a few key characters, a few key people in history, and then we focus on that narrative. So a lot of key players are going to be in the North. And so that's going to skew our perspective and determine what's remembered. Even with the Revolution, we forget the important role that the French played and helping America gain its independence. So there's a lot of tidbits that are left out that really complete the full story of the revolution. And Jacob, do you have anything to add before we get a little bit more into the Southern campaign?
Yeah, I'd say that, obviously war is complicated, any conflict is, but I think the Northern perspective of the revolution is a neater package to tie up with, the good guys, the bad guys. It's a lot cleaner in the conflict. But when the war moves to the South, it's just a different animal. You have a lot of very complicated landscapes, not only with the geography of the South just being different, but you also have many more diverse groups of people who all have a stake in this, very complicated conflict. There's not many established large cities like Boston or Philadelphia in the South by this point, mainly because the Southern colonies were a lot newer. So a lot of the fighting is happening in the backcountry. A lot of the fighting is happening between colonists themselves. The Battle of Kings Mountain, as you can see on the map, is one of our preserved Park Service sites. There's only one British regular officer there. Everyone else on that battlefield is a colonist. And so I think it's just harder for people to wrap their minds around. And it's harder to unpack that narrative in a quick history class when your teacher just wants to get on to the next subject.
Can I just to sort of chase this down a little bit, what is the role of telling this story about the revolution post Civil War, right? Where the South, the North won, the United States won, and the Confederate secessionists did not. Do you think that shapes this narrative that sort of glosses over what's happening in the South?
Good question. So to try to be brief, the South during the Civil War, the Confederacy does embrace the revolution. They definitely want to frame the fight of the Confederacy as a second American Revolution, trying to hold on to the same values and principles that their ancestors fought for. A lot of people are surprised that the Confederacy actually upheld George Washington as one of their founding fathers as well, because he was from Virginia. He fought for the same, supposed liberties that they wanted to fight for. But like I said, it's pretty complicated in the way that you're trying to define a Southern mindset. And I think the way that President Carter approaches the book and really approaches life in general is understanding that things are complicated. And what President Carter tries to do, because President Carter can very easily grasp complicated concepts, like that's one thing that he's amazing at. He tries to boil it down and explain it in a non-complicated way. One of the reasons why I think he uses the narrative of the book to communicate those values. So, I saw a lot of reviews online that it's not the most exciting book to read as far as plot lines go, but all the information in it is very correct. And like I said, it's a good medium to get across the complicated factors of the South. And obviously it's being written from a lens of President Carter, who has the advantage of being 200 years out from the revolution and 100 years out from the Civil War. So yeah, that's a very good and interesting question. Tanya, do you have any thoughts?
That sounds good. Yeah, absolutely. We can dive a little bit more into this map then and talk about the Southern campaign.
Please do.
All right, so right now in the North, the war is pretty much at a stalemate. And so the British decide to change up their strategy, and they're going to focus a little bit more on the Southern colonies. And they do this because they believe that there's strong Loyalist support in the South, and that means that there would be more reinforcements to support the army here. And so with the Southern strategy, the British plan to capture the ports of Savannah, Georgia, and Charleston, South Carolina. And having control of these deep water ports is going to allow the British to have access to supplies and reinforcements while also depriving the Americans of these things. So once the British, hope to gain control of these locations, these urban centers, they hope that there will be support across the colonies here for the crown. So if we look at the map at the southern portion in Savannah, that's going to be captured in 1776. And with Savannah secured under British control, Henry Clinton, who is the commander-in-chief of the British forces, decides to sail from where he's located in New York down to Savannah with a plan to capture Charleston. With the news that the British are going to attack this location, under the leadership of Benjamin Lincoln, the American forces decided to fortify Charleston to protect it. They're able to hold off the British for about 6 weeks or so, but they are outnumbered, and eventually they're going to surrender to the British. And over 5,000 men are captured during this battle, and it's going to be a major loss for the Americans. And something that I want to highlight during this specific battle is that the Americans were denied their honors of war. And this is because they were viewed as traitors and not as honorable enemies. And so this is going to come into play a little bit later at Yorktown, but that's something we can dive into if y'all are interested in that. But after that, Cornwallis starts to go through the Carolinas. He has some success in Camden, but some setbacks at Kings Mountain as well as Cowpens, where the Americans are victorious. And at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, the British technically win this battle, but it's at a pretty steep cost. And so Cornwallis decides that he's going to then go to the coast and he's going to get more supplies, and he's going to shift his attention now to Virginia. He believes to win over the South, he needs to get Virginia because this is where he believes the South is getting their supplies. And so he marches his troops to Yorktown, where eventually the Allied troops will have a victory over the British. And this will be the last major battle of the Revolutionary War, which will lead to America's independence.
Great, thank you. So Tanya, can you give us a little more about what happened next? So you just sort of brought us on like the Cliff's Notes version of the Southern Campaign. You brought us up to Yorktown. So what happened after the victory at Yorktown in 1781 and between that period and the Treaty of Paris in 1783 and our independence?
Absolutely. So the Siege of Yorktown is a monumental victory for the Allied forces. And this results in the British surrendering over a third of their troops. So that's over 8,000 soldiers. So after that, we're still going to see minor skirmishes after the siege, but Yorktown is the last major battle. After Yorktown, Washington is going to return to New York and keep an eye on the British while negotiations are taking place. But the Treaty of Paris is going to come into effect in 1783, and this treaty is going to end the war, and it also recognizes the United States as an independent nation.
No small thing. So we touched on this a little bit. Jacob touched on this. President Carter's inspiration, talk about his inspiration for writing The Hornet's Nest and his political philosophy, contribute, like how did that feed into his ideas about the revolution, and later his involvement with the bicentennial. And I'm going to wrap that into also a question that came from the audience, which is, are there any lessons from the book and from President Carter that we can think about today as we're looking at what's going on in Europe right now?
Yeah, that's a lot of a lot to dig into. Yeah. So I guess I'll start out by saying, President Carter is running for our nation's highest office in 1976. So he's bringing America into our second century. Sorry, did I say 1770? I meant 1976. I didn't say that. So one of his campaign documents is actually his first book that he writes. It's called Why Not the Best? And if you haven't read it, I certainly encourage you to. It's not very big at all, but it introduces President Carter to the American public, and it lays out not only his background and how he grew up and the influences that defined his character, but also his view on government. President Carter has a very organic view of government. He believes that in our republic, it's up to each individual citizen to do their best to bring about a good democracy where people are respected as people, where we help each other. It's quite inspiring if you get the chance to read it. And I think President Carter having that mindset really comes from his background growing up on a farm in Southwest Georgia during a time through the Great Depression when people didn't have a lot. President Carter's family didn't have electricity or indoor plumbing or even a phone when President Carter is living on the farm. And in a lot of ways, he personally says that the way that he's growing up in the early 20th century in Southwest Georgia is very similar to what someone in the 19th or even 18th century probably experienced growing up in the same area. So, in that type of community, you rely a lot on the people around you. He had a lot of role models, like his mother, who was a nurse, was in the South during a time of segregation, during the era of Jim Crow. And obviously there were some very complicated race relations, but President Carter's mother would help people with medical care regardless of their ability to pay or regardless of the color of their skin. She would also help out hobos who'd be traveling the railroad track that were right in front of their house. She'd always give someone something to eat if they needed it. And so I think a lot of that care from his mother's perspective of other people really inspired him to have a more community mindset when it came to his views on government. Kind of picking up on the philosophy of government too, when the American Revolution kind of kicks off, and you see this through a lot of the themes in the book, a lot of the characters say, well, I'm a British citizen, so I have certain rights. However, throughout the book, you'll notice that these characters get very frustrated when those rights that are supposed to be guaranteed to them as British citizens aren't being abided by or respected. You can go through like the first 60 pages and you can essentially see our Bill of Rights being outlined there with, trials by jury. You see petitions, you see assemblies, you see people just trying to speak out. And you see even religious exercise. And in all of these ways, you see people being oppressed, ignored, that their government isn't responsive. As many know, Parliament is in London, but the colonists didn't have any direct representation. So you do have a lot of, taxation happening without their represented consent. And when you look at President Carter's views on government, it's very Jeffersonian, believing that, the power is derived from the people and that government closest to the people is best. And that if the people of our nation have a mindset that community is important and we need to help everyone and everyone has basic human rights, then that government, just by nature, from the root of the people, will be inspired to govern well and help preserve those rights and make sure that humanity is also preserved. I think even if it was subconscious, again, within like the first 50 pages of the book, Henry Pratt's wife, Sophronia, she dies because of smallpox. And I think to many readers that might be kind of shocking to kill off what you think would be a major character in the book so early. But, President Carter's done a lot of humanitarian work with neglected tropical diseases around the globe, one of which is the guinea worm, which I believe in the last year, the Carter Center's reported that there's only been like 14 cases of guinea worm reported globally. That's down from millions when he started the work back in the 80s. And when you look at smallpox, what Sophronia dies of, it was also a very common disease. And smallpox was the first disease that was ever eradicated from the face of the planet through medical intervention. And you also see that President Carter, through his work with the guinea worm, may become the second disease to ever be eradicated from the face of the planet. So there's probably a lot of influence there to also understanding that it's not just about government, but it's about quality of life and how people can help each other. And, you know, for something even as disconnected from government as a tropical disease in a place that, you know, President Carter doesn't really have any personal connection to, aside from his efforts to eradicate those diseases. It just shows a global community, how we can all care for each other. And again, I think that all stems back to those values and rights and responsibilities of citizens that really come out of that era of the Enlightenment and this new realm of American political thought that we really embrace in our founding documents from the 1770s and beyond.
Great, thank you. We've got some like really amazing questions coming in the chat, but I want to jump to one from the audience just for larger context sake, right? So the book is called The Hornet's Nest. Why? Why is it called The Hornet's Nest? If we can get some insight on that, on the title, and then we can move on to the other questions. That would be great.
Tanya, I can answer this one if you'd rather.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. So the title actually comes from the physical landscape of the Western Carolinas and Northeast Georgia. The South at this time, as I mentioned, is kind of like a frontier area. Georgia's the newest colony, established in 1732. So if you do the math, that's just a little over 40 years before the Declaration of Independence. That's much, much later than, you know, some of the larger, more established colonies like Virginia or Massachusetts. Georgia itself was established not as an economic engine like Virginia was, but more as a buffer zone between the Spanish who were occupying Florida, but also the native tribes who kind of occupied the western area of Georgia, the Creeks, the Cherokee more to the north. And that's why Savannah is really established to be that buffer zone between an economic engine like South Carolina and the frontier. That means that being the frontier, the push west was a lot more shallow and a lot less developed, which means you have a lot of very old growth forest areas. The South has a lot of winding waterways, a lot of lowland with a lot of marshes. And so the Hornet's Nest is actually referring to that landscape that's very difficult to traverse. And when you look at Southern styles of fighting during the Revolution, they take tactics that many today would just call guerrilla warfare, not really lining up in a line like the British do. They do for good reason, but it's a lot of these hit, attack, you know, move on, a lot of these running battles just to harass the enemy. And so the Hornet's Nest itself really speaks to the style of fighting and the landscape that these patriots had to engage in and then use to their advantage because they were locals and they knew the backcountry.
Great, thank you. I hope that answers the question. So there's a number of questions that sort of lead into this. So what was the role of enslaved Africans in the war and the experience of Native Americans as they were removed from their homelands as part of the expansion of the United States? Jacob, you talk about frontier, but of course there were already people living in these spaces. We've also got a question, I'm just like to think about as you frame your answer, how pervasive was the fear that the British would free the slaves if they would agree to fight for them? Thereby, like, did that cause colonists who were like kind of on the fence to side with the revolutionaries? And then somebody's asking about the Lord Dunmore's proclamation in 1775. Again, same question, right? Calling for the freedom of the slaves who joined the Loyalists. So that's a huge question. But Tanya, I don't know if you want to jump in there and give us some context on the Africans in America and the Native Americans?
Sure. So during the Revolutionary War, the British offered enslaved African Americans freedom for their service. So at Yorktown, the enslaved provide labor for General Charles Cornwallis, and they did this by constructing the British fortifications around the town. So Cornwallis was eventually forced to push these individuals out of the town itself due to the lack of supplies as well as disease spreading throughout the area. So unfortunately, it was very challenging for these individuals who, offered their service and were hoping to gain this freedom and then to be kicked out of the British troops. And those that were able to survive this siege, they were captured after the American victory, and they were returned to their enslaver. And then on the Allied forces side, we have the story of James Armistead, and he was an enslaved African American, and he actually served as a spy for the Allied forces. So he gained the trust of the British and was a servant to Cornwallis. So he would take this British intelligence and relay it back to the Allied forces. And this information is what helped lead to the defeat of the British forces. So he played a crucial role to help get things moving and sharing information that was going on the British lines. And James Armistead, he was eventually granted his freedom due to the role that he played during the Revolution.
Great. Can you speak a little bit about the role of Native Americans in the Revolution and the removal of their homelands? And this feeds into another question we have from the audience, and you guys are amazing with these questions. The land grants for revolutionary participants result in Europeans populating the frontier land, like Tennessee. So those are sort of a related question.
Yeah, I can jump in here. So when we talk about native tribes in relation to the revolution or colonists, we have to keep in mind, as I've kind of mentioned before, it's a very complicated landscape. You have many, many different nations kind of vying for control of the land and the resources. So you not only have the colonists, but of course you have the British officials too. And let's keep in mind too that not all colonists are the same. There are very distinct differences between the colonists in Pennsylvania, in Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia. All these colonies were established at different times for different reasons. They have their own governments. They're essentially on different missions. So the fact that 13 colonies during the Revolution could band together and fight for one cause together, that in itself is a remarkable event. And many people also forget that Canada was also invited to join in the fight, but declined because they were actually afraid of their religious freedoms being stripped away. So it's a very complicated landscape, even within a lot of these groups. But on top of just the British, you have the French, who are out in what many would call the frontier, but they're actually just trading with the native tribes. A lot of these French fur traders, they're actually making familial connections. They're integrating themselves within the native tribes. They're learning their languages. You also have the Spanish, which can be very cruel to the native tribes. And granted, a lot of these are just generalizations, but you see the Spanish, even taking native slaves or forced education. And then, of course, the native tribes themselves are not monolithic. The Creeks differ from the Cherokee, differ from the Delaware and the Iroquois up in the Northeast. And so, each of these native tribes has its own mission. There may have been pre-colonial history between some of these tribes where they are either allied with each other or have long-standing conflicts with one another. And then, of course, you have, the Africans who are brought here against their will and are also thrown into this mix with their own culture, their own desires, and of course the institution of slavery too. So with all of this influencing the power, the territory, the resources of every other group, a lot of these native tribes understand that they don't have the firepower, the resources, or even the populations, or even the immune systems of a lot of these colonialist settlers, and to carve out their own space. They get very smart, and they try to play a lot of these powers off of each other. So they may not agree with the colonists coming in and taking more land and settling more land, but if they have a greater threat from the British government, well, it makes sense for them to ally their nation with the colonist cause. The same could be true on the other side, or maybe they prefer to fight with the French. So it's a very complicated political landscape. I know we're talking about land grants and a lot of these native tribes getting pushed farther west. You see a lot of the character Kindred and the relationships that he makes, especially with Nuota, the one Creek. That really unveils a lot of the differences, even in philosophy about property and ownership, that is kind of hard for someone like me, a person of European descent, to wrap my mind around. But it's important to understand that the way that they view property and land is very different than the way that a European culture like me would understand that. And so when you look at a lot of these treaties being made, sometimes they're being done under the threat of violence. You see it and described in the book with the treaty of, I think it was 1763. A lot of it's being done with debt being held over the heads of the native tribes. You see it a lot with just the idea that some members of those tribes will go off and make these treaties to cede lands, and then a lot of these other natives, even within the same tribes, not fully recognizing the authority of those purported leaders to be doing so. And you even see that there's a division within the Creeks, that some of them want to fight back, particularly the younger generation, while the older generation is more on the side of trying to ally themselves with the political entity that's going to get them the best deal moving forward. And so, like I said, there's a lot of political calculations going on. It's very complicated, but eventually what you do see is the British, the government officials, they try to establish a line of demarcation, saying, none of our citizens will establish settlements beyond that line, because we do want to honor those agreements, and we want to keep a Indian reserve, as they called it. But then you have a lot of frontiersmen who, for one reason or another, decide that they would rather move across that line, disobey the orders of their government, trying to seek a better life for themselves for their own reasons, but also occupying lands that aren't theirs and that their government says are off limits, but they do it anyway. And so once those lawbreakers essentially cross over that borderline and start occupying that land, then there's a huge push from the colonists who are on the ground saying, well, we live here anyway, why not just make it official? And so, yeah, it's very complicated, but you always see this push west as more and more immigrants do come into the colonies, and those who've already established their plantations, although they did it with a homestead that was legal, when more people come in and all of that original land is spoken for, people try to push west and try to open up new lands that doesn't have a legal deed to it yet. And that's where you get a lot of conflict, people just trying to establish their own little outposts in their farms to cultivate that land.
Thank you. So many questions coming in. So I want to talk a little bit about the sort of brother versus brother, right? The family member versus family member, and this is part of this sort of complicating history conversation, right? Like which I love. I think grappling with these complexities just helps with understanding how we got to where we are and who we are. But many think about the fighting of Americans fighting each other was unique to the Civil War. But the Hornet's Nest clearly sort of frames the Revolutionary War in a similar light, with neighbors against neighbors and families on opposing forces. Can you give us a little bit of insight into what, I think, Jacob, you sort of touched on it, right, with this complexity, and some people wanted to do this and some people wanted to do that. But can you talk a little bit about this division and this neighbor versus neighbor in the Revolutionary War context? Tanya, if you have some insight there.
Sure. So we got to think about the views that are coming into play for this, event that's occurring. So you have the Loyalists who, they're supportive to the crown. And this could be for various reasons. Maybe they have business ties to Great Britain. They have fear of committing treason, or they're just not supportive of some of the actions that are being taken during this time to oppose the crown. And then we have the Patriots who feel like their rights are being denied and they're not agreeing with what's being enforced, and they feel like they have a lack of voice. And so I think this conflict really comes into play in the South whenever the British forces take control of Charleston and Savannah. The shift in control is creating more conflict between the Patriots and the Loyalists, and this is increasing and fighting with the militias, and people, are destroying neighbors' properties. So it's just a difference in worldview of what's occurring.
And I think a lot of times too, we make these very broad statements about why people sided one way or the other. But the decision to hold a certain political view, it may be calculated for their own benefit. It could even be how much money they have in their pocket. When we look at the economy of the South at this point, it is based on large plantations with slaves. In fact, one of the colonial governors, it mentioned in the book, owned thousands of acres of property and had 500 slaves working that land. And when you frame the South as an economic engine, some of these, even plantation owners, may like the system the way it's set up, because if they've thrown in their lot with the British government and their officials, and the economic system is benefiting them well, that's good for them and they want to maintain that. However, if you're a plantation owner and your cash crop you would like to sell abroad at a better price, the British government had a pretty tight handle on the market and would only let you sell to the British, and therefore they could undercut you on the prices that you're getting for your crops. So it's a very interesting scenario where even people of the same social class, people who have very similar established footholds on the land, who are using the same system, they may even have different reasons, even economically, as to why they would side with one or the other. And then you focus on someone like Ethan Pratt, and he out in the wilderness, more or less, on his own, not in an established large colonial city. He's just out there trying to save up what he can to make his life better. And you see this a lot with Quakers or the Germans in Pennsylvania, where they just want their plot. They want to maintain an orderly farm, make a good living, and stay out of conflict. Even someone like him is drug into conflict, even with policies like the British demanding taxes being paid in hard currency, coins, gold, silver, but the British sucking all of the hard currency out of the colonial monetary system. And so when there's no money for you to be paid in to then pay your taxes, and you show up at the front door of the courthouse to pay your taxes with bushels of wheat, and they won't accept it, well, now you're a criminal. And you know, it's much more common, and it's mentioned in the book too, for a British citizen who's a colonist in America to be dealing with Spanish pieces of 8 than it is with British coin. And so, even just trying to save money to make a living for a lot of these folks is very difficult, and that could even influence why they decide to join with one group or another.
Great, thank you. I think the whole history of currency and money in this country is fascinating. Thank you for touching on it. It makes me very happy. We've got a comment in the chat that says President Carter said we get the government that we deserve, implying that democracy is not a spectator sport, and that we as citizens all have certain responsibilities to fulfill. And so in light of that, thank you, Stephen. In light of that sort of comment, what can we take from the revolution, what we've learned from the revolution, and apply to today? Like, how do we take that information and that history and those events and move forward?
Yeah, so I think when we talk about the revolution, or even when we talk in our modern day about our government, most of the talk is focused on rights. Like, what rights do I have that were either given to me by nature, God, government, etc., that I own and should be respected with. But the other side of the coin that many people don't talk about in the same sentence is the duties and responsibilities of being a citizen. So yes, you have the right to choose your representative leaders. However, that comes with the responsibility of educating yourself on the values, policies, the context around the country, and then doing your education on candidates and then voting. It may also mean that you go out and you run for office yourself. Yes, we have the right to free speech. However, that comes with the duty and responsibility to, again, educate yourself. That's one of the biggest pushes of the Enlightenment, is self-education and self-betterment. So you have to educate yourself and make sure that you're being responsible with your speech, that you're not spreading falsehood, that you're speaking out in a responsible way that's not going to tear down other people, but rather, having a vigorous debate about ideas, not a debate that's centered around hate based on who someone is. We have the right to a trial by jury, where if you read the book, Henry Pratt is executed just because the judge said you're guilty of treason. That's it. My ruling stands. You'll be executed at daybreak. However, in this country, we recognize that it's important to have a jury of your peers, citizens just like you, who can review the facts of a certain case, and they can come to a good decision about what justice is needed or not. But that also comes with the responsibility of serving on a jury. It's kind of become a cultural joke in America that, oh, I've been called for jury duty, how can I get out of it? Understanding that if you want each of these individual freedoms or rights, they do come with the responsibilities, even of military service and the draft. Again, it's something that's very complicated in our American history, but a lot of these freedoms sometimes are hard won against enemies of democracy and enemies of representative government. But when that duty is necessary, we do have that responsibility. And so we get a lot of benefit from living in a country with this form of government based on these ideals. However, the flip side is that it takes a lot from each and every one of us to maintain that. And I think that's why many people throughout history have referred to America as this grand experiment. A lot of European nations didn't think we could make it work because they thought it was too chaotic, that people would be too selfish or self-interested to not invest in these rights and responsibilities that really come with maintaining these freedoms and these liberties and rights that we've been given.
Cool. Thank you. Tanya, I am going to give you, as we're coming to a close, I'm going to give you the last word. So the question is, As we reflect on 250 years since the signing of the Declaration of Independence, what are your hopes for America's future for 2026 and beyond?
Yeah, so I think my hopes for our future is that we continue to foster an environment where we can have open conversations about our country, just like we're having today. As we can see, traditional narratives have focused exclusively on certain perspectives and stories and the exclusion of others. So I hope that moving forward, we continue to have these discussions and share the shared history of all Americans.
Great. Any last questions? We've got, well, actually, we're pretty much out of time. So I'm going to just share the screen again. Let's move you. There we go. Can you see the? Thank you. Great. So I want to thank everybody so much for joining us today and having this conversation. Again, it is just the beginning of conversations that I hope you have with us and with each other. Visit our friends and partners at the National Park Service. And please, we'll get a survey. There'll be a survey link in the chat and also in an email that you'll receive. We look forward to your feedback and your ideas, and feel free to contact us at engage@america250.org. So again, thank you, everyone. We'll see you again next time.